We would like to welcome and thank Dr. Claire Monks for being with us today. Dr. Monks is a distinguished researcher and professor of psychology at the University of Greenwich in the United Kingdom. She is recognized for her studies on peer relationships and on the dynamics of aggression and school bullying in childhood and adolescence. Throughout her career, Dr. Monks has explored how bullying behaviors originate, are maintained, and can be prevented in educational settings, with a particular focus on early childhood and primary education. Her research and intervention proposals emphasize the key role that friendships have and that developing positive peer relationships have as protective factors against school bullying. Her research work has had significant impact on the development of public policies and guidelines to promote healthy coexistence in schools, both in the UK as well as internationally. Dr. Monks collaborates with academic and professional networks. She is also collaborating with us in Chile, dedicated to the promotion of mental health and child protection, aiming to foster inclusive practices and learning environments that are free from violence. Her publications in high-impact journals reinforce her status as a global reference in the field of developmental psychology and bullying prevention. Dr. Monks, we're very happy to have you here with us, and she will be talking today about peer relationships and social behaviors among children in early childhood.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Veronica, for inviting me to be here with you today. So I'm just going to share my screen. I'm hoping that you'll be able to see that. So yeah, I'm going to talk today about peer relationships and social behaviour in early childhood. And this is some work I've been doing with former PhD student of mine, Dr. Katie Ricks at the Open University. So our focus has been particularly on young children, and one of the reasons for that is because it's a really important period for social and cognitive development among children. We know that they go through a lot of developments in terms of their executive functioning, so things like working memory, managing their emotions, and inhibitory control. Also, there are a lot of developments in terms of understanding other people's perspectives, such as theory of mind, and understanding how other people are feeling and their emotions, including things like empathy. So a lot happening during early childhood. And this is also a point at which the majority of children in most countries start some kind of out-of-home schooling. So children are between the ages of 3 and 6 in most countries are starting to be outside of the home, mixing with a peer group, perhaps for the first time, a regular set of peers. So it's a really interesting point in their development where they're first really engaging in that peer group. But there's comparatively less research focused on their behaviour during this period. Now, as we know, there's a great deal of importance on our own social relationships and on children's social relationships. They're a really important context for our development. Friendships and social relations provide us with opportunities for support and allyship. They provide us with really important social learning opportunities, and they're associated with adjustment. And they're slightly different to maybe some of the other relationships that children have, which may be more hierarchical in terms of a child with an adult. These tend to be more horizontal relationships. And we know that positive relationships can have associations with psychological well-being, with our adjustment, and some of our own research has looked at the associations with self-worth during middle childhood. But it's important to note that peer influence can be positive, but it can also be negative. And some researchers have noted that children who are friends with other children who behave aggressively may become more aggressive over time. So when we're looking at peer relationships, we often look at different types of measures which are tapping into different but perhaps associated aspects of peer relations. So we might be looking at social status, which is more of a broad measure of peer liking or disliking. In adolescence, we might be looking at perceived popularity. And we're also looking at friendships in terms of those close reciprocated bonds. And although social status and friendships might be related, they're not the same thing. So it's important to note that children could be quite liked by their peer group as a whole, but actually have very few or no close friendships. And it could be the reverse as well, where they're not particularly liked by their peers, but they have a couple of good friends. But very few studies have examined these types of peer relations, both forms, with young children in relation to their behaviour. And when we do look at associations with behaviour, the research indicates that aggressive behaviour is often related to being less well-liked, particularly among younger children, although I know that in older groups that there are some differences. When we look at children who are being targeted by aggression, there's less consistency in those findings. Some research with one of my former PhD students, Sung-Ha Lee in Korea, found that children who were targeted by aggressors tend to be less well-liked in the peer group. But generally, a lot of studies have indicated that there's no association. And that might be because what we find among younger children is that although aggressive behaviour is relatively stable over time, being the target of victimisation often is a transient experience for most children. They're not necessarily repeatedly targeted over time, so they may not display the same vulnerabilities that we might see in older groups. When we're looking at pro-social behaviour, so these sort of positive social behaviours, particularly if we're looking at defending behaviour in instances of peer victimisation, that's often associated with being quite liked. But not always. So some research that we did in Korea, we looked at different types of defending. So defender stop, where children were intervening and telling the aggressor to stop what they were doing, or defender tell, where they went and got an adult and told an adult what was happening. And we found that those children who told the aggressor to stop, they tended to be more popular. Whereas the children who were going and telling an adult were less well-liked. And that may be because of the consequence of going against peer norms, but it could also be related to, actually, if I want to help someone and I'm not particularly socially strong, socially integrated, that may be my only recourse to go and get some help. Solitary behaviour, children tend to have friends, but perhaps they're less well integrated, and that might relate to different nature of behaviour and the reasons behind it. When we're looking at friendships and social behaviour, one of the key aspects of friendship is reciprocity. So reciprocity is really important. It's where I say someone is my friend, they say, yeah, Claire is my friend. So we have that mutual connection. And some of our research in middle childhood has shown how important that reciprocity is for well-being, that actually having a unidirectional relationship, saying that someone's your friend, but they don't necessarily reciprocate, is not as positive for your well-being. And we know that defending behaviours tend to be associated with these sort of more mutual and positive relationships. We're also interested in who children are friends with. So obviously friendship is an important socialization context. So we know from research that homophily suggests that children choose friends who are similar to themselves, and socialization suggests that we become more similar to our friends over time. And there is some evidence from middle childhood to suggest that these processes may be happening in relation to behavior. But there are fewer studies with younger children, but it's really important that we focus on these because we may be seeing some reinforcement of children's behaviour, either positively or negatively at this age. And there is some evidence to suggest that aggressive children may be forming relationships with each other even at this early age, where our research has found that children who are aggressive and they have the same targets of aggression tend to support each other and defend each other. So they may already be starting to form these alliances. And we know that children who defend each other tend to identify others who are high in defending as friends as well. But there's less known about children who are solitary, although there is some suggestion among older groups that they may also be friends with children who are solitary. So we were interested in looking at how these peer relationships and friendships are associated with behaviour in quite young groups, particularly looking at the friendship nominations that children receive, the reciprocity in these relationships, and the similarity between children in relation to their behaviour. So the study, we recruited 193 children aged between 4 and 7, nice rough split of boys and girls there, and their teachers and teaching assistants. And we asked the children to nominate up to 3 children in their class who they were friends with. And from this, we were able to obtain the number of friendship nominations they received. We standardized that by class size because the classes were all different sizes. The number of friendship nominations they gave, the reciprocity in those relationships, and also the behaviors of their friends as well. We asked the teachers and teaching assistants to report on children's behaviour, and they were asked about aggressive behaviour, so physical, verbal, direct relational, so telling someone they can't play, and indirect relational, so around those sort of rumour spreading. We also looked at children being the target of those forms of aggression. We looked at different forms of pro-social behaviour, so helping, caring, sharing and including. And then 4 different forms of solitary behaviour, so unsociable, that's where a child doesn't want to be with others, shyness, active solitude, which is where children are isolated by others, and contextual solitude, where they may be on their own because their friends are not available or not around. We obtained ethical approval, obviously, from our institutional research ethics board. We interviewed children individually with our trained research team as a part of a larger project, and the teachers and teaching assistants completed their questionnaire in their own time. So if we move on to the results of this study, so we were looking at the number of friendship nominations received in relation to behaviour ratings from the teachers and teaching assistants. So we found a significant positive correlation between the ratings that children receive for pro-social behaviour and the number of friendship nominations they received. So children who were rated as more highly pro-social tended to receive more nominations from their classmates as a friend. We found a significant negative correlation between the teacher reports and teaching assistant reports of children's solitary behaviour and friendship nominations received, again indicating that as children had more solitary behaviour, they tended to receive fewer friendship nominations from their classmates. And that was a similar pattern for aggressive behaviour, where children with higher levels of aggression were receiving fewer friendship nominations from their classmates. When we looked at the number of nominations given, so children were allowed to give it up, well, they were encouraged to give up to 3 friendship nominations for their classmates. And we carried out correlations between the number of nominations they gave and the 4 types of adult reported behaviour. We found only one significant association, that was negative, between the number of friend nominations that they gave and ratings of solitary behaviour. So as children were more solitary, as their ratings for solitary behaviour were increased, they were less likely to give friendship nominations. But none of the other correlations reached significance. We also looked at the reciprocity of the friendships that children had. So this is where we looked at the friend nominations that children gave, and then we looked at whether those children had also identified the child as one of their friends. We carried out a Mancover controlling for age and gender, because we know that those variables can have an influence on some of these factors. And we looked at whether children had a reciprocated friend or they didn't have a reciprocated friend. We found overall that there was a significant effect. And when we look at the univariate analyses, what we can see is that children without a reciprocated friend were rated as higher on aggression than those who had a reciprocated friend. They were rated as higher on being the target of aggression than those with a reciprocated friend. Apologies. Whereas children who didn't have a reciprocated friend were rated as lower on pro-social behaviour than those children who had a reciprocated friend. And those without a reciprocated friend were scoring higher on solitary ratings than those who did have a reciprocated friend. So there were some significant differences there between children with and without reciprocated friendships. We also looked at children's behaviour and the behaviour of their friends. And the way that we did this was we created a composite score of friend behaviour based on the average scores of the children that the child identified as being their friends. So you can see here we carried out some correlations where we controlled for age and gender again between child ratings for the behaviour and the mean ratings of their friends. You can see a lot of significant findings there. What we were particularly interested in is can we pull apart there the differences between the different behaviours? So what we did was we carried out a series of multiple regressions to see whether friend behaviour predicted child behaviour. So we entered friend behaviour and child age and gender into the model. And for aggression, you can see that the model was significant. Child age was marginally significant. So that was where teachers were rating children who were older as more aggressive. Friends aggression was a positive predictor. So children who were higher in aggression, their friends were higher in aggression. And the same for solitary behaviour. That was also a significant positive predictor. In terms of victimization, we found that friends' aggression was a significant positive predictor of child ratings of victimization, and their friends' solitary behavior was also a significant positive predictor. For pro-social behavior, again, it was another significant multiple regression. We found that child gender was a significant predictor. So that was indicating that girls received higher pro-social ratings than boys. And friend pro-social behavior was also a significant positive predictor, but none of the other behaviors were in terms of their friends. And for solitary behavior, again, another significant model. And each type of behavior was a significant predictor. So friends aggression, friends pro-social behavior, and friends solitary behavior all were significant positive predictors of child's rating for solitary behavior. So what does this all mean, all of these findings? So if I take them one at a time. So if we're thinking about aggressive behaviour, so what we found was that children who scored higher on aggression received fewer friendship nominations, and that ties in with some of the other studies with this age group. So suggesting that it may be a reflection of their behaviour, or it could be that children who are less well liked perhaps are responding to this in an aggressive way, or it could be another factor such as social understanding, for example. Children without a reciprocated friendship were rated as more aggressive by school staff. And this ties into some of the work that we're currently doing in older groups, which suggests that children who are aggressive tend to have poorer quality friendships. So our studies suggesting that there's higher levels of conflict, particularly within those friendships. So reciprocity is a measure of the closeness of the friendship. So it may be that it's related to sort of poorer quality friendship. We also found that children identify others who are similar to them in terms of aggression and to a lesser degree solitary behaviour. And although research at this age has suggested that aggression is less of a group process than we might see in terms of bullying later on. So Kamadeka and colleagues found that there was little evidence of reinforcing type behaviours, encouraging, joining in or assisting aggression. And our research using observational studies really mirrored those findings. These findings might indicate the early origins of some of these group processes, where children are already forming these relationships with other children who are similarly aggressive to them. When we look at being the target of aggression, teacher ratings for being the target of aggression weren't associated with peer friendship nominations. So that supports some of the previous findings where really at this age group, children may be less easily identifiable, perhaps, in being targets of aggression, because there's a lot of changeability in this experience. Children who had no reciprocated friendships received higher ratings for being victimised, which may suggest some vulnerabilities in this group. And children's victimisation ratings were associated with their friends' solitary and aggressive behaviour. So it makes us wonder whether these relationships are supportive and positive. Perhaps there's aggression happening in those relationships, or could an individual who's solitary be able to support a child who's being victimised? It's worth having another look at. In terms of pro-social behaviour, children's nominations as a friend were positively associated with pro-social behaviour, which is what we would predict from other studies, but extends it from just looking at defending behaviour, but looking more broadly at more general pro-social behaviour. And children with at least one reciprocated friendship were also rated as more pro-social, which again suggests perhaps more higher quality or closer relationships in this group. And children's pro-social behaviour ratings were associated with the pro-social behaviour ratings of their friends. And that extends our research, which is focused on peer defending, to a kind of a broader context of pro-social behaviour. When looking at solitary behaviour, this was associated with receiving fewer friendship nominations from their peers, which ties in with some previous research that suggests they may have fewer friends. And interestingly, children who were higher on solitary behaviour also identified fewer others as their friends, which maybe suggests that they have an idea about their less expansive friendship network. Children without a reciprocated friendship nomination were rated as higher on solitary behaviour. And when we looked at who they were friends with, children's solitary behaviour was associated with their friends' aggressive, pro-social and solitary behaviour, which perhaps suggests that they aren't quite as able to identify particular children as friends. And I think that's something that, again, we'd want to have another look at. So future studies, there's some limitations obviously with this research. It would be really interesting. We looked at reciprocity as a sort of a proxy for friendship quality, but it would be quite interesting to use perhaps age-appropriate friendship measures to try and look at this in more depth. Unfortunately, the study was cross-sectional, so we weren't able to look longitudinally. And again, it would be really interesting to look at the interplay and the changes in these relationships and behaviour over time. A relatively small sample size, which meant that we weren't able to make more fine-grained examinations of age differences. And I think that would be really interesting because actually our age group was quite big, 4 to 7. So it'd be quite interesting to look developmentally at differences in that group. I think future studies might also want to explore behavioural profiles of children in terms of overlapping behaviours. We know that children don't just behave in one way. If we look at the research by Patricia Hawley around bi-strategic controllers, so children who are using aggression and pro-social behaviour, and we can identify children at this age doing this kind of behaviour. We also know that some children may use aggression and be quite withdrawn as well. So it would be quite interesting to look at the overlapping behaviour profiles of children in relation to their relationships. And it would also be of interest to look at the different aspects of certain behaviours. So certainly if we're thinking about certain types of aggression, so particularly relational aggression, maybe differentially related to different forms of friendships and relationships, then perhaps overt aggression. Or we may want to think about children who are solitary for different reasons. So again, I think, you know, these are things that we could look at in more depth. So trying to pull it to an end, in terms of conclusions, we know that there's some indication that peer relations differ in relation to different behaviour profiles. There were some differences in the reciprocity of friendships as well in relation to children's behaviour. And there was some evidence of homophily in behaviour among friends, but it wasn't always, you know, because of the cross-sectional nature, it wasn't possible to pull apart the role of selection and socialisation. So longitudinal studies would be really interesting in that field. I've just put a link to our paper, and then just to finish off, I just want to say thank you very much again for inviting me, and thank you for listening. And I just wanted to thank all of the children, the parents and carers, the teachers, the teaching assistants who took part in the research, and obviously my lovely co-author, Dr. Katie Ricks. So yeah, thank you very much for listening.
The time is up, so we'd like to thank everyone. We've been 30 people from around the world discussing on how to foster social relationships, quality of friendships in the early childhood, and how does that relate to education themes and purposes such as bullying. So thank you very much, Claire. And we'd like to invite you to our next webinar, which will be in December 10th. I believe, where Doctora Rosario del Rey will be presenting regarding cyberbullying prevention programs. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you everybody for your attention.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Claire. Bye.